Anouk and Josh are both writing about family, families that have endured loss, families that are coming apart. Anouk's book about a Satmar family takes place across generations and continents. Josh's story of an American Jewish family is set over a few days over a summer holiday in the Berkshires. So while their time frames are very different, they've both written novels in which the past hovers over the present in really powerful ways. Joshua Henkin is the author of The World Without You and 2 previous novels, Swimming Across the Hudson and Matrimony. His stories have been published widely. He directs the MFA program in fiction writing at Brooklyn College. Josh grew up nearby on the Upper West Side and now lives in Brooklyn with his wife and 2 daughters. Anouk Markovits is the author of I Am Forbidden, her first novel published in English. Her earlier novel, which is Pure Cotton in English, was written in French and published by Gallimard. Anouk grew up in a Satmar family in France, and she left when she was 19 to avoid an arranged marriage. Later, she had received advanced degrees from Columbia, Harvard, and Cornell. She lives in Manhattan with her husband. So Josh is going to read first.
So let me tell you a little bit about The World Without You so that my brief excerpt will make some sense. The book takes place over a single July 4th holiday in 2005. And the year before, in 2004, on July 4th, the son in the family, Leo Franco, was a journalist killed in Iraq. And he left 2 parents, 3 older sisters, a widow, and a young son. And they're all converging on the family's country house in the Berkshires for his memorial a year later. And the parents are about to split up. And you, the readers, know this because you discovered this at the beginning of the book in the foreword when the parents are preparing for everyone else's arrival. But the sisters themselves don't know about it. Parents are not planning to tell them till after the memorial. And the other thing that would be helpful for you to know is something about the 3 sisters. They're all packed in very tightly, sort of like my brothers and me. My mom liked to say that we were in diapers at the same time, which is testament either to how tightly we were packed or how long I stayed in diapers. So anyhow, Clarissa's 39, Lily's 38, and Noelle is 37. And to be somewhat reductive and glib, Clarissa and Lily were always successful in a kind of Princeton, Yale, clerk on the Supreme Court sort of way. And Noelle was kind of unsuccessful in a sort of sex, drugs, and school expulsion sort of way. And when Noelle was 25, she found herself randomly in Jerusalem as part of Around the World plane ticket, and she gets picked up, accosted, found, whatever your verb of choice is, by one of the Orthodox rabbis who spends time at the Western Wall, and she comes under his wing and under his sway, and she has since become an Orthodox Jew, and she has returned with a guy she knew years ago in high school who was then known as Arthur and is now Amram. They've been living together in Israel for the last 11 years, and they return for the memorial with their 4 sons, ages 7, 6, 4, and 3. So the Frankel family is a secular Jewish family, deeply secular, and Noelle and her husband Amram are deeply not secular. The other thing to know is that the parents, Marilyn and David, who are splitting up, have decided to get special kosher food and to actually buy kosher dishes so that Noelle and Amram and their 4 boys will feel part of the family over the memorial. They won't feel excluded. So the section I'm going to read from is the first moment when the whole family is together at dinner, and Noelle realizes that they haven't yet washed ritually, and she says as much. Amram and I need to wash, Noelle says, and Marilyn remembers. The ritual hand-washing before they eat bread, which they do at the start of every meal. How quickly she forgets, when the easiest thing is to remember Noelle as she was years ago, when there was no washing or ritual blessings, when there were, it sometimes seemed, no meals at all, when dinner for Noelle, despite Marilyn and David's objections, was a couple of Hostess Twinkies washed down with a tab. Is it possible she longs for that now? Amram breaks a challah roll into 3 and gives a piece to Noelle and a piece to Akiva and leaves the last piece for himself. Akiva leads them in the Motzi blessing, and it astonishes Marilyn to listen to this, the language her grandson speaks so effortlessly, the things he knows that she never will. Noelle removes a plastic bag out of which she produces a couple of turkey sandwiches and a tub of sliced cucumber. She passes out plastic cutlery and disposable plates to Amram and Akiva. "What's that?" Lily says. "Our food," says Noelle. "And paper dishes," says Amram. "You brought your own?" Lily's wearing a bright red shirt which matches her hair and a silver chain from which dangles an amethyst. Her skin is pale, but she flushes easily in the heat, and beneath the bulbs of the chandelier, color rises to her forehead. "We always do," Noelle says. "Don't tell me you've forgotten." Lily hasn't exactly, though it startles her every time. She feels vaguely offended on her own behalf and on her parents', as if everything they do, everything they touch, is contaminated. "But the food is kosher," Marilyn says. "Don't you remember?" She escorts Noelle into the kitchen, where, laid out in a row, are the chicken thighs, the caramelized vegetables, the corn on the cob, the pasta salad, the slushies. "That's nice of you, Mom. It's just..." "What?" "The dishes," Noelle says. "They would need to be kosher, too." "They are kosher," David says. "Don't you remember? We bought new dishes." Noelle is quiet. "What?" Marilyn says. "I don't understand." "You know how strict Amram and I are." Marilyn opens the fridge and shows Noelle a package of Miller's Swiss cheese with the rabbinic seal of approval laminated across it. "The kitchen itself would need to be kosher," Noelle says. "The oven, the dishwasher, the microwave, everything." "Are you kidding me?" David says. He's ready to chronicle the hours he and Marilyn spent cooking, the trips to the kosher butcher, ready to lay out the receipts for the dishes and pots, all so Noelle and Amram and their 4 boys could eat in their house, so they wouldn't feel excluded over the holiday. "I'm sorry," Noelle says. "I should have told you not to bother." "Well, we did bother," Marilyn says. "I'm sorry," Noelle says again, "but what do her parents want her to do? Eat something that's not permitted?" Now Marilyn is back at the table and she's looking at everyone and she starts to cry. "Oh, Mom," Noelle says, "I'm so sorry. We know how hard you and Dad must have worked." "I don't care about the food," Marilyn says. "You and Amram can eat what you want to." "What's wrong then?" Marilyn glances up at David, but he's looking away. She thought she could wait until after the memorial, but she sees she can't. All her plans, her whole life, feel like folly. "Dad and I need to tell you something." Everyone looks up. "We have some news you need to know." "Marilyn," David says sharply, "you said we were going to wait." They were going to wait, but she can't do it. She can't do anything but sit here and stare at her family, even as she knows she must talk. Outside in the distance, a siren blares. From upstairs comes the sound of a grandson coughing. "Dad and I are separating," she blurts out. "You're what?" says Lily. "We're splitting up," she says. "I'm leaving Daddy." For several seconds, there's pure silence. "Are you kidding me?" Clarissa says. David says, "Do you think we joke about something like this?" Meanwhile, Marilyn is trying to explain things, though she can't explain them even to herself. She won't say those words, that she doesn't love him anymore, because they're not true. "We lost our son," she says. "It's ruined us."
Thank you very much, Josh. Here's Anouk.
I am Forbidden spans 4 generations, from 1939 Transylvania to post-war Paris to contemporary New York. The first passage I'll read is set in 1948 Paris. Revived by her Sabbath nap, Hannah took in the girls' silence. She made them sit next to her, one on each side at her head of the table. Holding the girls' hands, Hannah sang, "Auf dem Weg steht der Bäum, steht angebeugen. Alle feig auf einem Bäum, sennen sie zerflogen." The tree stoops by the roadside. Its birds have flown away before the storm. Hannah turned to Mila. "Did your mama teach it to you?" "Yes." "Sing with me, Milanka." Mila joined in. "So geht zu die Mama her, soll's mir noch nicht stören, weil ich Mama 1 und 2 bald auf Eigeln wären. Mama, don't try to stop me. I will become a bird. I will sit on the tree. I will well it through winter. Hannah shut up, clasping the girl's hands. Atara pulled away. Hannah took Mila by the waist. Oh, yaddy-daddy, yaddy-daddy, yaddy-daddy. In the room filling with dusk, as Queen Sabbath bowed her adieus, Hannah and Mila turned to the melancholy rhythm, to the old broken melody, asking the young girls to bind up its wounds and carry it forward. Hannah turned to Atara. Come, Atara, dance. Atara pushed back her chair and clasped the doorknob. Why were they singing, I so want to be a bird, the way they sang, I fully trust in the Messiah's coming? The bird song was different. It was about how she and Hannah and Mila felt, not about how God felt. Atara, come, dance. Atara curled tighter at the foot of the door. The bird song was a trap. All of Hannah's songs were traps. In the next passage, very short, I'll read, we see Mila, the 8-year-old who was dancing a decade later, 1958, Williamsburg, Brooklyn. In front of the 3-sided mirror, Mila draped her shoulders in the silk stole, the sign that would convey to Joseph that she was permitted. In the silent room, she thought she could hear her parents pray to live again in the generations Joseph and Mila might bring forth. Joseph stood at the foot of Mila's bed. He listened for the soft rustle of the eiderdown as she lifted a corner. May our union, her thighs under him, opening, grant us to draw holy children, holy souls for our children. This time they did not separate immediately. Only after Dam Betulim, hymeneal bleeding, must bride and groom separate immediately. This time, they would not have to separate until she menstruated, if she menstruated. They lay next to each other in the dark. There were rules prescribing everything up to and during, but this moment of simply lying together felt entirely unbounded, unruled. She pressed closer to him, and his beard felt silken in the night. For the next 2 weeks, Mila rushed to the front door as soon as she heard Joseph step on the landing. Once, she struck up a song, shyly. Mila had not sung in front of a grown male since she was 12. But Joseph was her husband, and it was permitted. Auf'n Weg steht der Bäum. You don't know the words? Repeat after me. So geht zu die Mama her. And she led him in her dance. Yadi-da-di-dum.
Thank you both very much. I thought we'd start by talking about the inspiration for your novels. Maybe Josh, why don't you begin and tell us how you came to write this?
Sure. I guess I would say that there were two inspirations. There was one in terms of the content of the book, if you can call it that, and then one was an aesthetic inspiration. My grandfather was a famous Orthodox, I mean, I would say famous, I make him sound like he was Lady Gaga, but he was a well-known Orthodox rabbi on the Lower East Side who lived in the US for 50 years and never learned how to speak English, and it wasn't because he was bad at language. He just lived at a time when the Lower East Side was the Lower East Side of your, not where you went to go to a club. And so the one time every year that my father's side of the family, that was the side of the grandfather, got together was on Purim, because all other holidays, my grandfather didn't want to invite people over because the rest of the family, much of the rest of the family had assimilated, and he didn't want them to force them to travel on Shabbat. So Purim was the one time when the whole family got together, and after he died, that tradition continued, and my father and mother used to hold a Purim reunion for the family every year. And since a lot of us didn't see each other except for at that Purim reunion, we would catch each other up on what happened, during the year that had passed. And I had a cousin who died of Hodgkin's disease when he was in his late 20s, and I was only a toddler at the time. The generations are very skewed in my family. I have a first cousin on one side who's 84, and a first cousin on the other side who's 23. This will get me into the Guinness Book of World Records. So I didn't really know this cousin, but his death hung over the extended family for years. And about 30 years later, when I was in my early 30s at one of these Purim reunions, my aunt, my cousin's mother, got up and said, she was catching everyone up, she said, "I have 2 sons." And we were all quite startled because she once had 2 sons, but her older son had died 30 years ago at that point. And she was a somewhat difficult woman, but she was not crazy. She understood full well that her son had died. But this was her point, that was the seminal, singular event in her life, and nothing wasn't influenced by that. Nothing was the same afterward. Meanwhile, my cousin's wife eventually got remarried and moved on. She had a child. And there was always incredible tension between my aunt and my cousin's wife, her ex-daughter-in-law. And it got me thinking that, and I've been fortunate to have neither of these experiences happen to me, but my sense is that in general, especially if you're relatively young, if you lose a spouse, partner at a relatively young age, as hard as that is, you eventually pick up the pieces and move on, whereas if you lose a child, it's much, much harder to move on. So the inspiration for the book was really that gap between what it's like to grieve for a spouse and what it's like to grieve for a child. And so the central tension in the book for me originally was the tension between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. And then I started to write about these 3 sisters, and the book went in a direction I hadn't divined. Because it's okay for a novelist to think he or she knows where a book is going, but you better be wrong. If you're right, you get what a friend of mine calls Lipton Cup of story, where you're injecting your characters into a preordained plot. That's the basic. There are other inspirations, but I want to give Anouk a chance to tell us her inspiration.
Several things came together. I had actually fled the world. I tried to escape the world that I was writing about, that I ended up writing about. But I was living in the States, and there was a resurgence of religious rhetoric in the political discourse that made me feel uneasy. And then that combined with, between 9/11, the suicide bombers all believed that they were behaving according to their religion. And that made me feel, it sort of reminded me where I was coming from. I came from a fundamentalist environment, and I began to feel that it is possible that my experience might be a foil to explore what it means, what those values were. When I started to write about that world, I thought that my work would be a scream against all the ways in which fundamentalism had hurt me. But then I realized that the scream had been written. There are many memoirs and there are novels written by people who leave. And what I couldn't find were novels written about the people who stay. And so that's what I try to do.
And what is it about families that you find so interesting? Josh, what drew you to write about a family?
Yeah, I mean, people ask me that a lot because all 3 of my novels are about families. And I kind of feel like, what else is there? Maybe that says something about my family. Well, I think what Tolstoy said about families is true, that, all happy families are alike and all unhappy families are different. And I think that fiction is very committed to difference. I mean, I teach fiction writing. I teach only graduate students these days, but when I used to teach undergraduates, one of the struggles with teaching undergraduates is it wasn't the quality of the work that was a problem, it was that they always really liked the worst stuff. And I would say, and I always knew, so sometimes they really liked the story that I couldn't understand why they liked it. And I'd say, well, why do you like it? and they said to me, well, it's because that character reminds me of so many people I know. And I used to thought that is exactly the problem, is that it reminds you of so many people you know, and I think fiction is very committed to the enterprise that no two people are alike. And so I think that being able to write about families, be they happy or unhappy, is a chance to really explore the differences among human beings, which is really what I think fiction is about. And also, we're all born into families. Many of us create families on our own. So it's really what our lives are about. So I feel like if someone said to me, you must write only about families for the rest of your life, I'd be okay.
I didn't set out to write about families. It ended up being a novel about an extended family, several generations. I think that one reason why family was a great place to investigate the kind of issues that I wanted to explore was that it is in the relationship between father and daughter, for example, that in a fundamentalist setting, you see that the idea of law being stronger than any other bond manifests itself. And what intrigued me was that I sensed that there was some kind of a relationship between how that intransigence in the fundamentalist world was tied to religious imagination about sacrifice and the idea, in many ways, the binding of Isaac is a founding myth in Judaism, and those kinds of relationships, the relationship, father-daughter, there I lived in fundamentalist environments where families will shun children if they behave differently. I just felt that was a great place to investigate fundamentalism.
So tell us a little bit about the story. What happens when one of the daughters decides to know that she has no choice but to leave?
So she's in many ways a minor character in the novel, since she's the one who leaves and the novel is mainly about people who stay. But pretty much once she decides to leave, she has to be dead in the conscience of all the people who stay. So in the novel, she disappears. It's the people, because the novel is about the people who stay. So when she leaves, she's dead.
And right, so the father will have no contact even as she tries to be in touch with them a bit over time?
As I say, the novel doesn't cover this. She just reappears at the end of the novel. It's the character Atara. And yes, for her father, she is basically somebody whose name has to be erased. It is a world where there is absolutely no tolerance for any deviation, and so she doesn't exist. Of course, it doesn't mean that she's not alive in the conscience of the people inside. And certainly the relationship with the mother, as it is shown at the end of the book, is different. Even if it has to be without the father's knowledge, the mother and daughter will have some sort of relationship.
So also both books kind of refer back to violence. And your book actually starts with a really horrific, violent act. I wonder if you might describe that and why you felt you wanted to begin that way.
So the very beginning of the book is actually a wet dream. And I structured the novel, I started with a very intimate relationship between the body and the law. And it is basically a scene in which the main character, the character of that scene, Zalman, sins in his sleep. And then we see him as he attempts to expiate that sin. And the scene that you're referring to, which is really the second scene in the novel, in many structurally or thematically was to show or to that in the same way that the law does not tolerate the body, the story that the law tells about history, which is that God basically protects his chosen people, is also a problem. And the second scene in the novel is a scene from the Holocaust where we see, very briefly, a Holocaust scene.
And Your book also refers back to the war
Right.
Afghanistan.
Yeah, so I mean, Leo's a journalist killed in Iraq, and it's funny. About 8 months ago, once the book was already written, but before it came out, my agent said to me, "So Josh, what are you going to say when people ask you about Daniel Pearl?" And I said, "Oh, no one's going to ask me about Daniel Pearl." So now I'm intercepting you, because everyone instantly asked me about Daniel Pearl, and although the book is about a journalist killed in the Middle East, I wasn't in any conscious way thinking about Daniel Pearl when I was writing the book. Flannery O'Connor talks about how a writer needs a certain measure of stupidity. And some of us come by that naturally, and others have to cultivate it. But I think it's really true. I think that, especially for the first draft of a novel, you really proceed intuitively, and it's not a question of whether it's going to be a good book or a bad book. It's a question of whether it's going to be a book at all. And the example I give is that a friend of mine in college wrote her psychology thesis on how adults group objects versus how kids group objects. And the adults group the apple with the banana, and kids group the monkey with the banana. And that's a way of saying that kids are more natural storytellers than adults are. One of my jobs as a writer is to teach myself how to think like a child again, albeit like a smart, sophisticated child. So I think of critics as being apple banana people, and I think of novelists as being monkey banana people. That said, I wasn't so stupid as to not think that I probably was aware of Daniel Pearl, at least subconsciously. He was out there, in the air. But the book is very deeply not a political novel, and it's certainly not a war novel. And I think the reason I had Leo get killed in Iraq, well, I certainly want him to die quickly. It's a book that's in very compressed time and space, and it wouldn't have worked if he had cancer or he had something where people knew he was going to die. So I could have had him killed in a car crash. That sort of felt banal, or it didn't seem as interesting fictionally to me. And as I started to write these characters, it became apparent to me that the characters themselves are all very political. Marilyn, the mother, and Lily, the middle daughter, for example, went down in 2000 to Florida to protest Bush v. Gore. They took off time to campaign for Kerry together. On the other hand, Noelle, who lives in Jerusalem, voted for Bush twice absentee, and she voted for him even after Leo died. And Lily, her sister, who doesn't get along with Noelle, accuses her basically of killing her brother by voting for Bush. So because I was writing about a family that was very politically engaged, it seemed interesting to me to write about a death that was political in some sort of way. But it didn't start with the violence, it started with the family.
Thanks. Another point of agreement with the books is that you both actually were able to write from several different perspectives, really getting to the minds of various characters. I wonder, was that a particular challenge in writing this, to write from everybody's point of view?
Yeah, I guess the answer is yes, but I feel like everything is a particular challenge. I feel like the longer you write fiction, the harder it gets. And I guess it sort of gets back to the question of inspiration. I mentioned the Purim story of my family before, but there was also an aesthetic inspiration. My last novel, Matrimony, takes place over the course of 20 years and is told principally in 2 points of view. And I think of novels as being rebounds, the way relationships are often rebounds. And so I wanted to write a very different kind of novel. I was predetermined to write in very compressed time and space, but to have the vantage point be much more spacious and to go into many points of view. And it's funny, I'm always telling my graduate students to be careful about switching points of view, and then I talk the talk, but I don't walk the walk. I think there are risks in going to many points of view, in that the book can lose a kind of focus, but I think if the book itself already has focus, then it's much easier to do it. The way I think of it is like a spine. And if you have a solid spine in your book, in your novel, then you can have lots of neurons. Bear with me with this terrible analogy, but you can have lots of neurons shooting out of it. But if you don't have a strong spine, you sort of have a lot of neurons flying around out there in the ether. And I think for this novel, there was a solid spine in the sense that there were 2 central events: Leo's death a year earlier and the parents splitting up right now. And that gives the book a kind of focus, and it allows me to move from point of view to point of view. But I kind of enjoyed it. I feel like it gave the book a kind of expansiveness that it wouldn't have had otherwise. Was
there a particular voice that was strongest or that has stayed with you the most?
Well, I mean, I think it's always the case for a novelist that he or she may gravitate toward a certain character, but then I think you need to overcompensate and head in the other direction, because I think you need to treat, you don't need to like all your characters as human beings. I mean, that's one of the great myths these days of fiction writing, is that, characters need to be likable. And of course, this is not true. That in fiction, just like in life, the goods are not doled out equally. Some people are more charming than others. That's just kind of how it is. And I think one of the great pleasures of fiction writing and also of fiction reading is that you get to spend time with characters on the page whom you wouldn't want to spend time with in real life. I mean, would you want to spend time with Humbert in real life? Maybe not. But I actually think he's quite but he's quite interesting to spend time with on the page. So I guess the only thing I'd say is that maybe Noelle, because she is so different from the rest of the family, I mean, the rest of the family is sort of a kind of stereotype. I mean, they're not stereotypes, obviously, but they fit a kind of, well, you know the line in Annie Hall where Woody Allen meets, I believe it's his first wife, Alison Porchnick, and she's introducing herself to him, and he says, "Oh, I get it. Upper West Side, Jewish intellectual, Brandeis Socialist summer camp, father with a Ben Shahn painting on the wall, stop me before I make a total fool of myself." And she says, "No, I like being reduced to a cultural stereotype." So I feel like, I can't believe I remember that from years ago. But anyhow, I feel like that cultural stereotype is the Frankels. I mean, Marilyn is a doctor up at Columbia Presbyterian. David is a teacher, got an English PhD at Columbia. The daughters went to Ivy League schools. Lily clerked on the Supreme Court. And Noelle is the one who's really different. She's not traditionally successful, and she's become Orthodox. So maybe because she's different, that's the voice that came to me most clearly. But that as you go along, you learn to fall in love with all the voices, because you can't, Michael Cunningham, who directed the fiction MFA program at Brooklyn College before me, likes to say that you have to think of your minor characters as major characters in another novel who have simply made a cameo appearance in your novel. And I think that's really true. I think that any character who's on the page for even a clause has to be thought of as a serious character and someone you treat with dignity. I know you don't have to like them, but they're no throwaways. So my goal is to not, if I find myself gravitating toward one character, is to make sure the other characters get the requisite attention they deserve.
Anouk, I loved all of your characters. I wonder if there was one in particular that you felt most connected with, or who, again, the voice has stayed with you?
Yes. I think it's the character of Joseph. Joseph is a young boy who witnesses the murder of his family, and is saved by a Christian maid and stays with her for 7 years. Then he's brought back to Satmar by a Satmar family, and all his life he remains deeply divided. And in many ways, that character, deeply divided, who perhaps doesn't know, faithful to the mother he has to his two mothers, his first Jewish mother and his adoptive mother, faithful in his heart, but he's not permitted to be faithful in the life he lives. I suppose that ambivalence, that division, is something that is deeply sympathetic to me, that I feel very close to.
Mm-hmm. Josh, what's the process of writing like for you? I think you said, each time you sit down, the page is just as blank.
Yeah, the page gets blanker and blanker. I can't believe it can get any blanker, but it's starting to get even blanker than I thought possible. So yeah, I mean, I think, Imagine Why it took me 10 years to write. The World Without You took me 5 years. Swimming Across the Hudson took me 3. So I mean, every book takes as long as it takes. I would imagine when I threw out 3,000 pages. With The World Without You, I threw out 2,000 pages. I'm very good at throwing out pages. And I think you have to write a lot of bad pages to get to the good pages. So Sandee, you're asking about sort of what my writing process is like? Yeah. Well, I mean, like a lot of people, I have a busy life. I direct this MFA program, and I teach in it, and I have a wife and 2 relatively small kids and friends and, hobbies and things like that. So you have to guard your time. What I try to do is I try to write 3 hours a day, 5 days a week during the semester. I write from 9 till 12. And that's pretty much my sacrosanct writing time. I live in Park Slope, and I go to the Brooklyn Writer's Space, which is the place where I have a carrel and where I haven't learned the internet password. And that lets me focus on my writing. And then, during holiday breaks and over the summer, I write, many more hours a day. I hate first draft. I love revising. During the writing of Matrimony, at some point my computer broke down, and so I had to write by hand. And it was actually a real blessing, because like many writers, I'm very compulsive on the sentence level, and I tended to revise as I went along. And I think that's a big mistake in general for a novelist. If you're writing short stories, which I do also, it's a little easier to do that. But if you're revising as you go along, and you're a novelist, what a lot of times happens is that you have a beautiful scene that doesn't belong in your book. And you really need to churn through till the end. And because I have really terrible handwriting. In fact, in college, I had to read my exams to professors all the time. And I went to Jewish day school, and a lot of times people think that I'm writing in Hebrew when I'm really writing in English. It's just scroll. But I think writing by hand helped me a lot, because there's something about seeing the text on the screen and seeing it neat that makes me compelled to make it neat in a deeper way. But because my handwriting is so sloppy, I didn't feel compelled to revise as I went along. It allowed me to churn through till the end. So that's the process, and then you keep writing until you're so sick of your characters that you can't revise any longer, I think.
Did you have to do a lot of research to write this?
Yes. Although I grew up in a Satmar family, pretty much anything that has to do with historical facts are never taught. And so all of this I had to research. For example, with regard to the Rebbe's escape from Transylvania on the Kastner train, the story in Satmar is that the reason he was saved is because Kastner had a dream in which he was told, or not Kastner himself, someone in Kastner's entourage had a dream in which that person was told that if the Rebbe wasn't saved, the mission would not succeed. So if you're trying to write a novel, you could take that point of view, but I thought that it also, that I needed to research a little bit more. And then all the aspects that have to do with actually the Talmud is something that I also needed to research because in ultra-Orthodox environments, girls do not study the Talmud. So I had to research that too.
I know the novel's not autobiographical, but I wonder if you could sort of tell us a bit about your life and that you've left and achieved, remarkable success in degrees in several fields. How did you manage that?
It's a very long story with lots of false starts and many identity crises. And I think what you see as successes is really like, how do you say, l'écume, the top, what is visible, what's underneath is actually a lot of struggle and a lot of failures. So I arrived in the States when I was 19. I was being sent here to meet somebody for an arranged marriage. And I knew at that time already that that it wouldn't be fair to whoever it was that I might marry, because I was not a believer, and I knew that. So I had no choice but to try to escape, because there is no room for compromise in that world. So I arrived in New York. I knew that here I was of age. At the time in France, you had to be 21 to no longer need your parents' signature on even an application to college. So I thought this was my chance. And how I actually left, I didn't know New York, and I didn't know the States. So, well, I'll be very brief, but I'm not going to say many more details, but basically I saw an ad in the Village Voice where somebody was asking I was forming a group to cross the country with a bicycle. And I thought, well, I don't know how to get out of New York. I've got to escape my family. Maybe that's the way. And of course, they were looking for athletes, and they were looking. But I thought, well, maybe. So I did answer the ad, and I joined the group. But I only stayed with them for 2 weeks because I had very urgent matters to try to solve. But that's how I got out of New York, and that's how it was the beginning of my experience in America.
Good. Thank you. Thanks. Josh, when I asked you about your connection to Jewish texts, you said that it was Jewish time that you felt most connected with. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, I am connected to Jewish texts. I went to Ramaz for 13 years. One of my teachers is in the audience here. She made me memorize a lot of Navi, so I would never ever say that I'm not connected to Jewish text. But I think as a novelist, I think novelists in general, and sort of me specifically, are very interested in the question of time. And for me, I grew up in what I'd call a complicated Jewish home, although that's probably redundant, right? I mean, what Jewish home is not complicated? But I grew up not that far from here, on 116th Street and Riverside Drive, and I mentioned a little bit about my paternal grandfather, and my father was a law professor at Columbia for 50 years, and he remained observant, but his life was very much the secular world of the university. My mother is also Jewish, but she grew up in a very different kind of Jewish home. She grew up in the 40s and 50s on the Grand Concourse, and she went to the Walden School, which is now defunct, but it's a progressive private school with no walls between the classroom, and everyone campaigned for Adelaide Stevenson and thought we'd be speaking Esperanto. And so my mother did most of the compromising in terms of we kept a kosher home, we kept Shabbat, but socially, my parents very much existed in the secular world. So I went to Ramaz for school. I went to Camp Ramah. In the summer, we sometimes went to Colorado, where in Aspen, where I rode horses and no one had seen a Jew. So I feel like I was a voyeur in a lot of different cultures, and I think that was very important. But time was very essential to me because I always associated time with the Jewish calendar. Shabbat starts at 6:29 and is over at 7:24, etc. I mean, everything down to the minute, and then we have a leap year, 7 out of every 19 years, I believe. So this year we have a double parsha. That year we don't have a double parsha. I was very conscious about time in terms of Jewish ritual. And the story goes that when I was probably about 5, and we were switching the clocks forward, for daylight savings time, I turned to my parents and said, "Do non-Jews switch the clock forward too?" So I do think that my sense of time is very borrowed and born of Jewish ritual, and I think that's been very important to me as a novelist, because my characters in all 3 of my novels and in the stories I write, they're living in the present, but they're also always looking back over their shoulders. And I think, if we think about Jewish history, the way in which we talk about our ancestors is very essential for my upbringing, and I think it's really bled into my work as a novelist.
And why July 4th as the setting for this?
Why July 4th? It's funny. I do think that writers are stupider than we are given credit for. And then we have to pretend that we're not as stupid as we are. No, I think a lot of times what happens is that you don't quite know why you did what you did, and then you have to sort of speculate. So I guess what I'll do is I'll speculate. I needed a chance to get the family together, and so a holiday, July 4th, Thanksgiving. This book was actually deeply influenced by Rick Moody's novel, The Ice Storm, which I really recommend to you all if you haven't read it already. And that takes place over a Thanksgiving holiday. So I think having the book take place over a holiday was essential. But I think also, and again, this isn't conscious. As I said before, I'm a monkey banana guy. But if I can put on my apple banana hat for a second, I think what I was doing was I was interested in a certain kind of contrast. Like, why did I set the book in the Berkshires? It seems to me that, Leo was killed in the Iraq War. Whatever political opinions you have, whatever feelings you have about the Iraq War, I think it's fairly indisputable that a lot of horrible things happened in Iraq. Whereas it seems to me that the Berkshires was created so as to erase all trace of horror. So, what is it like to be mourning in the Berkshires about something that happened at great geographic and cultural remove? And people have asked me, I think somewhat strangely, why I made Leo a journalist as opposed to a soldier. And to me, the answer is very obvious. Secular Jews on the Upper West Side don't spawn soldiers. They spawn journalists. I just wasn't the milieu I was writing about. And I think one of the things that interested me in writing about parents who lost a son who was a journalist is that Marilyn in particular is very opposed to the war and, took up arms against the war, metaphorically. And, I think that, I know a lot of people who had strong feelings about the Iraq War, but I know very few people in my circles who know anyone who fought in the Iraq War. I don't know anyone who fought in the Iraq War. So even though I might have had strong opinions about it, it was really at one remove, it was somewhat abstract. So here we have a family where it becomes very not abstract, it becomes very concrete. It touches them in the most fundamental human way possible. And what's it like to have no one to turn to, no one to commiserate with? They don't have other mothers and fathers who have kids who have died in the war. So I think that kind of contrast was interesting to me in general, which is why I made Leo a journalist, which is why I set the book in the Berkshires, and I think it's also why I set the book over July 4th. What's it like to be mourning when everyone else is celebrating? And what's it like to be mourning about someone who died in a war that you feel ambivalent about while everyone else is celebrating a country that fought in that war? And so I think it allowed for that kind of contrast that was very essential for the novel.
Thanks. So both books have kind of surprising endings. Without giving them away, I'm just curious if you knew when you started where the books were going to go, if you knew that you would end where you did, how you did.
The first character I knew that I wanted to write about was the character named Judith. Judith is the young girl who is 17 and discovers that she's forbidden to marry. And when I decided to write about the fundamentalist world, I remembered what Roland Barthes said. And he said that the task of literature is to always point at what is scandalous in whatever it is that you write about. And when I thought about, well, what can I identify as perhaps one of the most scandalous things about not just Satmar, but perhaps all of ultra-Orthodox Judaism, it was the issue of the mamzer. It was the issue of these children who are written up in registers and are forever forbidden to marry in the communities in which they grow up. So I did know when I started the novel that Judith would be, I wanted her to be my main character. And I knew that I would end with her. She ended up not being the main character because Judith is a character who is a firm believer and who believes in fixed meanings. And she was not open to change. And as anybody who writes novel knows, a character who is not open to change is not a character that you can really make a main protagonist of. So she's no longer the main character, but she begins it and she ends the novel.
Thanks. Josh?
Yeah, no, I had absolutely no clue. I never have any clue where my books are going to end because, as I said before, then you are injecting your characters into a preordained plot. I think the relationship between plot and character is complex and symbiotic. We both create our own stories and are created by them. And, Flannery O'Connor, in her book of essays, Mystery and Manners, talks about the ending of a story having to be surprising but inevitable. And I think that's true. Most endings that don't work are simply surprising, namely implausible, or simply inevitable, namely predictable. And I think what you need for the ending of a story or for a novel is for it to be surprising but inevitable, that you didn't expect it, but when it gets there, it feels exactly right. And I think for that to work for the reader, it has to work for the writer too. I think the writer really needs to be surprised by what happens. The final book that you see before you is so different from earlier drafts that you wouldn't recognize it.
So the question is to Anouk, and whether there is something positive that she can say about Satmar life and positive or good?
Well, I would widen the question and say, is there anything good and positive about ritual? Well, I would say yes. There can be some lovely things, but it's a world that's deeply steeped in ritual, and it's a world where family ties are extremely strong, and that there are, of course, positive aspects to family and to ritual. Now, they can also end up pushed to extremes, and that is the problem of fundamentalist environments, is that these very same values that can be formative and that can be, can help you build an identity and can carry you through life, can also stifle you and can destroy you. And so it's a double-edged sword. They have sort of, it's very strong and very dangerous.
The question is whether she still has relationships with family and people in the Satmar community.
So after I left, I was ostracized, and I was not, basically for decades, I did not have a relationship with my family. I never saw my father again, but I did see my mother, and in particular, during the years, several years before she passed away, I was able to have not a very, I was able to have a relationship with her of some sort. And I also have some interaction with my siblings, although I must say that since the novel came out, I have not heard and I have not yet dared. I'm not quite sure. Some way or another, I'll have to, they will have to deal with it, and I will have to deal with it. I hope that we can still have a relationship.
So the question was, the person who asked the question said that when I was speaking before, that I said that Noelle resonated with me, but when she read the book, she found that Noelle and Amram, the Orthodox characters, were the least intelligent, the least self-aware, and so she wanted to know what my relationship to Orthodoxy is. So just to be clear, I wasn't saying that they resonated with me. What Sandee asked me was, did certain voices come most immediately to me? And I think because they were different from the others, then those particular voices, Noelle and Amram's, came to me first. I guess I would say that certainly Amram, Noelle's husband, is not someone that I would want to spend a lot of time with on a desert island. He's particularly aggrieved, he's self-righteous, but he interests me as a character. My goal as a writer is to treat all the characters fairly, which isn't, as I said before, to make them all equally likable, but to give them all a fair shake. And I think I did that, and if there are readers who feel that I didn't, then I've failed with those particular readers. In terms of my relationship with Orthodoxy, I think I sort of covered that a little bit before in terms of my family, that my father grew up in a very Orthodox home, remained Orthodox but was kind of a maverick. My mother grew up in a quite secular Jewish home, became observant for the family, but it never really took. She herself is not personally observant. So yeah, I'd say I have a lot. I went to an Orthodox Jewish day school on the Upper East Side for 13 years, so I have a lot of experience with it. There are different kinds of Orthodoxy. There are different. I feel like fiction is the anti-generalization thing, and so I would never want to generalize about Orthodoxy or about non-Orthodoxy. Why did I choose the name Noelle? Yeah, the novelist Robert Cohen has a really good essay in N+1 about how he can't finish his new novel because he hasn't found the right name for his character, and I think that's really, really true. So, again, the stupid but honest answer is that Noelle sounded like the right name to me. Now, of course, once I'd written it, people pointed out, well, Noelle, Christmas, did you think about that? And the answer is no. Same like Daniel Pearl. No, I didn't think about it, but I'm probably not so stupid as to believe that I didn't, somewhere in the back of my mind. And of course, Noel. So the word El in Hebrew is God. The word no in English is no. So Noel, all sorts of things, but that's, again, all the job of the critic. The job of the writer is to find the name that on a gut level feels right. Because, and this is actually very important, that apple, banana, monkey, banana example may be somewhat glib, but I think it gets at a kind of truth, which is that a novelist, I'll sometimes say this to my graduate students after workshop, where there'll be something emotionally hazy about the story. And I'll say to the writer, well, what did you want the reader to feel? And sometimes the writer will look at me like, huh? And my response to that is, huh? In other words, that's what writers do, is they try to make readers feel something. I want my readers at the end of my novel to know my characters as well as or better than the people in their own lives. And if they have done that, if they feel that, then I've succeeded with that reader, and if they don't feel that, then I've failed with that reader. And so, in order to be able to do that, you cannot be thinking about anything bigger, about symbolism, about messages. To my mind, in good fiction, there's never any message. If you want a message, you should be a journalist, or a priest, or a rabbi, or a political scientist, or a speechwriter. What a novelist does is he or she tries to make characters jump off the page, and he or she writes stories. Nothing more, nothing less. And so for me, when I come up with a name Noel, or when I come up with any name, it just feels right. And it doesn't feel right in the first try. That's why you throw out 3,000 pages, is you make a lot of mistakes. But it's about feeling. It's about nothing else. That's how you make someone have an emotional response.
Do you agree about messages? Do you want your readers to take away a certain message from the novel?
So I agree that, you cannot really, if you're writing a novel, whatever, it cannot be about messages. But I find that if you follow the rules of the novels, which is that you start to look at everything from multiple point of views, you no longer have one message. And so in many ways, I think that as long as I followed those rules, I was doing two things at the same time, is I was both writing a novel and I was also deeply anti-fundamentalist. And you could say that, yes, there is a message, the message is that there is something anti-fundamentalist about what I'm writing, but that's embedded in the genre of the novel, because fundamentalism can only have one point of view and a fixed point of view, and what the novel wants is multiple point of views. And so the very act of writing a novel, which is one reason I have such admiration for novels, is that the kind of layered and complex truth that a novel forces the writer and the reader to confront it's not that it's without a message, but it's complex and layered.
So we really, really thank the Jewish Week so much, because they continue to be able to bring us amazing, wonderful, outstanding, incredible teachers. And tonight is no different than any of our other evenings.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.